43 and 55 million people. That's a lot of need. Secondly, I haven't mentioned all kinds of migrants or forced migrants, irregular migrants, stranded migrants, trafficked persons, and none of these fit conveniently in any of those above categories, but once again, they are people that are in significant need of protection. So let's move on to refugee camps. These little guys, by the way, are were in a camp in Burundi called Ngara. So these were people that had been in those camps from 1993. This photograph was taken in 2004. So they've been there a significant period of time. You can tell by their clothing. Let's go back to the previous one. You can tell by their clothing how all the resources they have available in the camp, and some of the other photographs will show you some of the distended stomachs, and I better not start talking about it because I won't stop. In terms of the refugee camps, there's 8.5 million people in approximately refugee camps right now. The average time to be in a refugee camp, any guesses? That's a 2006 statistic. And the camp conditions I've already referred to. However, I will say this, that you should note that the United Nations has taken on a lot more responsibility in regard to ongoing emergencies, not simply in regard to refugee protection issues, but in all kinds of situations where there is, for example, in Pakistan, where there's mudslides, etc. What you don't see often is, of course, the UNHCR has very limited capacities. I experienced this when I was in Africa. What happens is the latest emergency gets the resources, and suddenly somebody that's already been there for 10 years, they are old news in regard to resources, and things even tend to be worse. So certainly the problem of protracted refugee situations, which is the UNHCR word, warehousing of refugees is the more aggressive U.S. committee word for it, but certainly it is a drastic problem. What you don't see there are the so-called urban refugees. So these are the 3 to 4 million people who are not in camps and are just littered about the world, usually in an irregular status, or they've been recognized by the United Nations, but the country they're in doesn't recognize them and doesn't really care. So we've got another 3 to 4 million out there in those kinds of situations. Egypt would be a really good example of that. And when you hear about people that are trying to sneak into Israel and are being shot by both the Egyptians and the Israelis, these are people usually from Sudan that have been there for years, are utterly desperate, and are willing to risk their lives simply because of their desperation. So let's talk about geographic distribution. The most notable of these 3 figures is the bottom one, the so-called well-to-do countries. 4% of the refugees are located there, and then you see the other forms of gradations of poverty where the great majority of refugees are located. In terms of major refugee source countries, I don't know why I'm looking at that, I've got it right here. So if you look at that, there's a couple of things to note. First of all, the source countries are Africa and the Middle East. And the Middle East often turns out to be Iraq and several different forms of that. And of course, I think Somalia is on more than one list as well. You probably know if you're reading the news, the Somali situation that is slowly improving has now fallen apart again in the last year. At the same time, we can look at the major host countries, and guess what? Once again, except for good old Sweden and the Iraqis, primarily the countries are, again, African or Middle East, and the obvious observation is they are the countries who are contingent to where the civil disputes, where the state breakdowns are occurring. So what it really means is that refugees have been ghettoized not only in camps, but in the portions of the world where the countries that are least able to provide them with support and assistance, some of which aren't even signatories to the convention. And I would say in general that the UNHCR policy, which is not just the UNHCR, the policy of all the nations who have pretenses towards international protection, their three-stage strategy of voluntary repatriation, which is the first one, or secondly, local integration, and then thirdly, resettlement to a third country like Canada, that policy has been a resounding failure. 17 years in purgatory is obviously far too long. The next slide is interesting. This is the industrialized countries. I put up a few stats about them for a couple of reasons. The industrialized countries are the ones, there are 44 of them. Essentially, they're the ones that report asylum statistics on a monthly basis. So that's why they get to be in that category. You won't find, for example, a country like South Africa that's there. Nor do you find Thailand there either. So there are a lot of these countries. That's why I showed you the first ones. The countries that are really doing the major host roles, because they're poor, they can't count everyone, so they don't end up on charts like this. So in terms of the receiving countries, we see, guess what? All of the countries that have got all the money to count. And let's go back to the other one in terms of the that's the receipt. Can we go back to the previous one? Because there is something to note here, and in a way this is a little bit sad if you actually look at the refugee flows to developed countries. Iraq is still up there, Somalia is still up there, but all of a sudden we start seeing countries like Russia. Afghanistan, you can understand why Afghanistan's up there. You see China, Serbia, Nigeria. That's not to say that there aren't serious human rights issues in some of those countries, but this is where what we start to see, and this adds a complexity to the discussion that we're going to have about asylum systems in the West. You're seeing more this phenomenon of mixed flows, and in particular what you're going to be seeing in that regard is what's called the cluster effect. So for example, most of the Russians are going to Poland. Most of the Serbs are going to France. Virtually all of the Mexicans and most of the Haitians are coming to Canada. So it's a more kind of targeted refugee flow moving. Okay, let's go from there to, since we're talking about our industrialized countries, we're going to talk about Fortress Europe. What's that? That's right. It's coming. It's coming. And in terms of fortress, I assume you're all aware of that concept and the notion that their asylum policies have really been generated by two central policies. The first one is interdiction. So the various ways, and I'll talk about that in a minute, the various ways in which they actually try and keep people out. And even though when I say Fortress Europe, there is a Fortress America as well, and Little Fortress Australia and a few other places. And secondly, their asylum systems have tended to be quite narrow and parsimonious in their procedures and in their decisions. So internally, what they've done is they've relied on something called the Dublin Agreement, now the Dublin II, and essentially what Dublin said is it's their version, long before we had ours, of Safe Third Country Agreement. So the first country that you arrive in within the European community, that's the country where you're obliged to claim status. And they try and fingerprint you immediately, so if you pop up in Germany, France, or England, UK, they want to send you back to where you first came. And that strategy worked alongside the notion of the accession countries, part of having the Central European countries come into the European market, not the sole reason, but certainly one of the very significant side benefits was it created a kind of buffer in terms of the flows coming into Europe.